Hello, everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is Election Edge. It is 6 o'clock on the East Coast, 3 o'clock out west, and boy, I tell you, folks, we have a very, very special guest, Ken Khachigian, who was an advisor to President Nixon, President Reagan, and over the course of this hour, we're going to give you a history lesson and talk about things that were just absolutely amazing. Ken had a front row seat. Literally, as Kamala Harris says, the last person in the room. Ken Khachigian, welcome to Election Edge. Again, it's an honor to have you as my guest today.
Hi, Mark. Thanks. Good to be here.
So Ken, you wrote the book Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. And Ken, I know you researched this book. I believe 4.5 years was the time frame it took to
Right.
draft the book. Can you share with our audience what went into that and what made you decide to give us a window into history here? And our audience will be soaking this up, Ken.
Well, I decided to write it because I had had conversations with Presidents Nixon and Reagan over those years that nobody else had ever heard before. History-making conversations, and I had participated in episodes of history that nobody had ever seen and heard before, and have been parts of campaigns, especially the campaigns of '80 and '84, where I was a central figure participating with President Reagan as his chief speechwriter. And of course, the times I had with President Nixon out during his revival after his resignation. So there were times of historical periods where I participated that were just critical parts with presidential legends and historical giants that nobody else had contact with. This is not a ghostwritten book. This is a personal book based on, I had like 4 file cabinets full of notes and diary entries and contemporaneous writings that I had kept over the years. And for example, the 6 chapters I wrote on the presidential campaign of 1980 were unknown to anyone else because I had I kept a tape recorder, a small cassette tape recorder that I took with me, and little mini cassettes. And at the end of the day, to the extent I could, if I wasn't so exhausted, I dictated in that tape recorder my memories of the campaign day. And so I have 35,000 words of memories of that 1980 campaign inside the campaign with Reagan that nobody else has had. And those 35,000 words now are in the Reagan archives. They aren't available to anyone yet because I haven't released them, but I've deeded over that. But I've so many memories of conversations, hundreds and hundreds of hours with former President Nixon in the San Clemente, and then when he left for New York, and after his in his post-presidency, where I became a close confidant with him. And then one of the critical parts of the book and the history of the book is that no one knows about is that Richard Nixon became a close advisor to Ronald Reagan in his post-presidency, in Nixon's post-presidency, and in his 1980 and '84 campaigns. So that when I left to become Reagan's speechwriter and close advisor in the '80 campaign and '84 campaigns, and through his presidency, Nixon used me as a conduit to pass along secret memos to Reagan that have never before been written about, and those are in the appendix of my book. So these and other conversations and memos and other historical facts that have not surfaced before anywhere else were critical to history and to political historians that I thought had to be written about.
Ken, you talk a lot about in that 1984 election, which everybody knows Ronald Reagan eventually won in a landslide, but it wasn't always so easy. He actually stumbled a little bit in that first debate. And based upon your relationship with Richard Nixon, Nixon, I believe in the book you mentioned, actually reached out to you, to President Reagan at the time, to really hone in on his communication skills. And Nixon would always talk about, in your book, you mentioned he painted a vivid message for the listener and the viewer, and his use of descriptive colors and pictures. And a lot of people don't realize it, but Richard Nixon was very instrumental in that 1984 campaign with when Reagan really turned it around in that second debate after the press had gotten all over him.
Well, one of the important things, and you really stumbled. You didn't stumble on it because you've captured it. And I wrote about it in the book, is that in that first debate, Reagan was just over prepared. He was, and Nancy Reagan hit the nail on the head. She called it, he was brutalized. He was prepared in the absolute wrong way. He had the wrong team preparing him. And I describe it, and then that's another reason I wrote the book, because the record had to be made clear. He had the wrong team preparing him for that first debate. And so he stumbled a little bit, and he had lost his confidence, self-confidence. And so he had to get his self-confidence back. And Stu Spencer, who was running the campaign at the time, said, why don't you have Nixon send in a memo, and it would help boost Reagan's confidence back up. And so I called President Nixon up and I said, Mr. President, why don't you, it'd be great if you could send a memo in to Reagan, President Reagan, and help boost his confidence back up. And Nixon wrote a long memo in which it's in the appendix of the book, and I excerpt it in the book. And he gave Reagan several ideas on what to do, and boosted his confidence back up. He said, "Don't worry. Look, you're going to win this election, and at the end of the day, Mondale's still an unrepentant liberal." And he wanted to get Reagan focused back on the economy. He said, the economy is a critical issue in this campaign, and you get focused back on the economy, and you're going to do well. Just keep focused on the economy and use your communication skills. And that memo was passed along to Reagan, and Reagan had enormous respect for Nixon, going way back into the 50s, late 50s, when Reagan first checked in with Nixon when he decided to turn from being a Democrat to a Republican. So he had respect for Nixon, and that memo helped buck up Reagan's self-confidence in that second debate with Mondale, and helped revive his campaign, along with a whistle-stop tour that we did in southern Ohio.
You came to the White House at the age of 26, and I believe in your book you said you worked initially with Alan Greenspan. Can you talk our viewers and listeners, how you actually met Richard Nixon? Was it through Greenspan? And how did you go from a 26-year-old lawyer to really the pinnacle of power, advising two of the most consequential presidents in the history of the United States?
Well, I started out, I was a law student at Columbia, 23 years old, as a Columbia law student, and I was always fascinated with politics, and it began back in my early days in California. I loved politics. I had read Six Crises, and I was enamored of Nixon's career. And I saw an article in the New York Times that he was going to run again for office. And when I saw that article, I thought, well, maybe there's a chance to get involved in a presidential campaign. And Nixon, back in those days, was not exactly thought of as the leading candidate for president, because after the midterm elections in '66, Governor George Romney of Michigan and Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York were the bright leading stars of the party, and Ronald Reagan had just swept into victory in California, and he was a rising star. So Nixon was not head of the pack, and so people weren't flocking to him to want to work in his campaign. I thought, well, this is a chance, and I like Nixon. So I wrote a letter to him at his law office in New York and said, geez, could I work in this campaign? And well, the first letter wasn't returned, and well, I kept a carbon copy. You know, people don't know, kids don't know what carbon copies are these days. And maybe you don't even know what a carbon copy is. But we had to do that with typewriters because I didn't have a copying machine in my room at college. So I typed it again, and my wife worked on Wall Street, a couple of blocks from his office, and she walked it over to him, and then you know who responded to me was Pat Buchanan. Pat worked for Nixon in that the early part of the early days of the campaign, and so Pat said, "Come on over for an interview," and he said he teased me later. He said, "I thought you were a Rockefeller spy because you were at Columbia University." But despite that, he gave me a shot at Mark. He gave me a shot at coming over to volunteer. So I answered correspondence, sort of doing the scout work. They saw an eager beaver, and every chance after class at law school, I'd take the 104 or 105 bus up Fifth Avenue to the headquarters and work in the campaign office. And finally, Martin Anderson, who was an advisor coming out of the Hoover Institute, said, "Why don't you? We can hire you in the campaign." In '68, Nixon was headed for the nomination. So that summer, that's when I hooked up with Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was the domestic policy advisor. He was an economic consultant. He had an economic consulting firm, Townsend Greenspan and Associates, and he was the head of domestic research for the '68 campaign for Nixon, and he was my boss. And I had a little niche. I had a niche area that no one else had in agriculture because I came from a farm out in Central California. But I did a lot of research in that, transportation and housing, and then I had to go back to law school and finish law school. And then after I got my passed the bar in California, I came back and started working in the White House at age 25 in 1970.
Okay. So when you're in the White House, you become friends with Richard Nixon, and a lot of people, obviously, they remember what happened in the second term, but Nixon had some tremendous accomplishments, both domestically and on foreign policy. Ken, can you walk us through some of the things that went into that? Things like the relationship with the Chinese, détente, the policies, many of his other accomplishments, lowering the voting age, the EPA. I mean, Richard Nixon was involved in some monumental positive changes for the United States, and I think he's earned a lot of respect for what he did accomplish, especially during that first term.
Mark, it was amazing what he did, but it was even more amazing that he got it done at all, because I talk about how he came into the presidency facing three massive headwinds. When he came into the presidency in January 1969, people have to remember he inherited a war. He was a wartime president. He inherited a war from Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. They started that war in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson, who was the president before Nixon, left him with 540,000 troops in Vietnam, 500 men were being killed every month when Nixon came into office. That he didn't begin this; he inherited it. Thousands of casualties every month, in addition to the 500 boys being killed every month. And Johnson had stopped the bombing of the North in Vietnam, which was a critical tool that Nixon could have used, but Johnson had stopped the bombing. So Nixon inherited that war and immediately tried to end it by reducing the troop, doing a troop reduction. So he had that headwind that he inherited. That's one headwind. The second one was the entire 5.5 years of his presidency, he had a partisan Congress. He had Democrats leading the House and the Senate the entire time, a very partisan Congress that was very antagonistic to him. The third headwind he had was an adversarial press. You had back then you had only three networks. You had ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they were mostly negative, unbalanced towards Nixon. And then you had three news weeklies, magazines that were the majority of the magazine that managed the news every week. And you had two major newspapers. I'm a little bit oversimplifying, but by not much. Washington Post and New York Times, which were liberal. And so you didn't have any of the social media. You didn't have cable news. You didn't have any the equivalence of what we're doing now, this kind of discussion we're having with you, Mark. We didn't have any conservative cable news networks. We didn't have Twitter or X or any of the social networks, Instagram, where people could communicate with each other. We didn't have blogs or anything else to offset all this adversarial media. So against all those headwinds, he started to make great progress. Now, China at that time, if you look at China today, people go to China and they see people driving Teslas and having iPhones in their hands and going to McDonald's and going to Starbucks and internet cafes and wearing modern clothes. But that's not what China looked like in 1969 when Nixon came into office. China in 1969 was a crazy country. It was a rogue communist dictatorship led by a maniacal leadership that looked, in 1969, China looked like North Korea is today. It was sort of a crazy country with a lot of crazy young people that they call Red Guards. They would run around the country with these little red books. They were the Red Guards. They were with Mao's little red books, they called them, and they had murdered. Mao had murdered several people on his way to the top, and they had ballistic weapon systems, nuclear weapons. So they were an international threat. So Nixon came into office confronted by that rogue nation, along with the Soviet Union, which had all the captured nations that they had. And they had already invaded Afghanistan in the previous year. Plus, they had their own massive international intercontinental ballistic missiles. So he had to disengage those threats. So he had an incredible foresight of saying, we've got to do something about China. So he began the process of saying, we're going to have to make some introduction to them. That was one big step that he took. The other one was starting the process of détente with the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of the conservatives in the Reagan era didn't think that was such a great idea because they liked the hard line that Reagan took. But it was important to begin the steps of engaging the Soviet Union at that time, like Nixon did. But he did achieve some big treaties, the anti-ballistic missile treaty and the strategic arms limitation talks. which started the fundamental negotiations with the Soviet Union. But in the process, domestically, he achieved some major things like in 1969 and 1970, leading up to that period in the South, schools were still segregated. So Nixon began a process of desegregating the schools in the South, and he succeeded in that. And that was a big step that the Democrats, Johnson, Kennedy, and previous Democrats never could achieve, despite all their bragging about being sympathetic to civil rights. They could never achieve the desegregation of schools. Nixon did. Nixon achieved what's called Title IX of the Civil Rights, which allowed equal treatment for women in sports. He achieved welfare reform. He achieved, now a lot of people aren't crazy about the Environmental Protection Act, but that's been a major step for a lot of people in cleaning the air. And of course,
that was what. Pardon me. Go ahead, Ken. Yeah.
And then you mentioned two things, two very big things. He lowered the 18-year-old vote and provided the 18-year-olds, and he took away the draft. So if you're an 18-year-old boy right now, it's a lot different situation than it was back before Nixon was president. You were susceptible to the military draft. Now it's an all-volunteer army.
Kenny did some fascinating things, and it's just a great walk through history hearing you describe it in the book. We're going to take a 90-second break. We're a little bit over, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the Nixon transitioning and how Ken got involved in Ronald Reagan's campaign and some of the great things that happened with Ronald Reagan. We'll be back in 90 seconds.
Former National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, pleaded guilty today to lying to the FBI.
He was one of the most respected generals in the military.
Every American needs this historical DVD keepsake. Flynn delivered the truth, whatever the cost. Hand signed by General Michael Flynn. Order now at the Patriot TV store. Use promo code PTV at checkout to get special savings. The Patriot TV store, a secure, hassle-free shopping experience.
Throughout history, the spirit of patriotism has prevailed. The battles may have changed, but the values remain the same. Today, in 2024, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment where the call for unity, freedom, and a better future echoes louder than ever.
For more than 10 years, Patriot Mobile has been committed to supporting the values that make our nation great.
With affordable plans and reliable nationwide coverage, Patriot Mobile is not just a wireless service. It's a call to action for those who believe in the American dream. Because this year is not just any year, it's the most important year since our nation's founding. Choose a wireless carrier that shares your values. Choose Patriot Mobile.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most precious assets, silver and gold. Call Kirk Elliott Precious Metals at 720-605-3900. That's 720-605-3900.
And a special thank you to Dr. Kirk Elliott. Please call him 720-605-3900. He is a great supporter of Patriot TV. And we're back with Ken. Ken, again, such an honor to be speaking with you today and just the prism of history that you can describe to us. I wanted to take us through two pieces of the book, talking about what happened when Nixon lost his support, and then after he left office, the guidance and the counseling that you did with the former president and setting up the David Frost interview. Can you walk us through that piece of history from those darker days to the brighter days that later came for Nixon post his presidency?
Well, you're referring to the last few days of the Nixon administration, and that's chapter 1 in the book. And I hope people will go to my website, www.reaganandnixon.com, and take a look at the opportunity and purchase the book, so that they'll get the full opportunity to review all of it. But that first chapter deals with that's how I start the book. It deals with the last week before President Nixon's resignation. It's literally a day by day, hour by hour recitation. I was on the anti-impeachment team working with Chief of Staff Al Haig and Ron Ziegler, the press secretary who was helping lead the anti-impeachment fight. And I was scheduled to go on the floor of the House to be part of the team that was going to fight the impeachment. And unfortunately, at the very end there, we had a tape come out. They called it a smoking gun then, but we misinterpreted it. As time has passed, we've determined that we've misinterpreted it as being a smoking gun, when actually even John Dean has conceded it was shooting blanks. The tape does, as we now know, does not show the president obstructing the investigation. So, but that's not what we thought at the time, and but it was the culmination of 2 years of the president under a partisan investigation by the House and the Senate, and by the partisan special prosecution staff led by initially by President Kennedy's opposition research leader, and by people from Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, and a very partisan Congress. So and I have to tell you that an adversarial press was not. They weren't all on President Nixon's Christmas card list. I have to tell you that. So it was a very difficult time, and the Republicans were they were very squeamish. They had been dealing with the problems that defending the policies of the Vietnam War throughout all those years of protest. And besides which, the economy was going into recession at that time. And because of the Arab oil embargo of October 1973, gas prices had gone up by 35%. So all in all, it was not a great time to be a Republican. And they were very nervous about supporting the president. And that at that point, it was the president's political support that had gotten weaker and weaker. And Nixon had determined that, quite apart from what his legal options were, his political support was being undermined. And so without the political support in the House or the Senate, he decided that instead of putting the country through the turmoil of an impeachment and months and months and months of a trial in the Senate, the more dignified thing to do would be to resign. And so then he went to San Clemente, and a couple of weeks later, I followed him out there for a brief period of time to try to help get his affairs in order, because he had no money, because obviously he had no job. They were trying to disbar him in California and New York. There were subpoenas flying around. The special prosecutor still wanted to indict him, and they were after him for back taxes. So we were trying to get all his affairs in order, and that's when I first began to sit down with him. And you would think that he would, people asked me, was he depressed? Was he down? And I was 29 years old. I thought my life was over with. And because I was part of this team that thought we would fight on, and now we had nothing to fight for. So he sat me down, and just a few feet away from where he sat, and I could see the Pacific Ocean over his shoulder. And he said, "Ken, don't be down. We have to look forward. We can't look back. We have to move ahead." And I thought that was the most amazing lesson in life I ever heard. Here he had lost the most precious thing he had ever worked for in his entire life, and it had been taken away from him. And you would think that he'd be resentful and bitter and angry. But he was lecturing me not to be depressed, and telling me that a lesson in life was to move ahead. So after going back to Washington briefly, I came back to San Clemente to help him restore his life and his career by working on his memoirs, which provided an income, and to help him tell his story. The memoirs told the story in writing, and he had to tell his story also via media, and the best medium was television. He frankly didn't trust the networks to do it, so he picked David Frost, who he thought would be at least somewhat fair, being from non-American television. He asked me to take a break from writing the memoirs to lead the research for all the preparation for the Frost interviews. So I took about 6 weeks off to help him prepare, along with Diane Sawyer. Diane Sawyer was my colleague working on the memoirs, and she had the Watergate portfolio in preparation. And then we did the preparation for what was about, I think, 29 hours of total taping, which was reduced to 4 hours of interviews. And the Watergate 1 hour interview on network television, on the television show that they had, I think is still the most widely watched news interview in history. And that's when he took it upon himself to let the American people know that he felt that he had let them down, and that he had felt remorse for what had happened, and that he had given his adversaries a sword, and they twisted it in, but that it was over with now, and it was time to move on. And so he got Watergate behind him in that interview, and then went on to move his life forward. And throughout the years, it worked out for him.
Ken, he authored what, 8 or 9 books post his presidency?
Nine best-selling books.
9 best-selling books, and obviously out in Yorba Linda, California, we have the Richard M. Nixon Library, and I believe you're Chairman Emeritus on the Board of Trustees, and again, just a great recollection of Richard Nixon history. Let's take a little diversion here. Talk about how you got involved with Ronald Reagan and the campaign, and your involvement with, the Gipper, and arguably, but particularly in Republican circles, among the greatest Republicans ever.
Well, Nixon finished the book, and he was frankly a little bit bored. He felt that San Clemente was a difficult place from which to operate out of. It was hard for people to travel out this way to visit with them. He felt that San Clemente was not where, as he called it, the action was. And so he decided it was time to move back east to New York, where he could be more involved with what was going on. And that left me without a source of work. And so I had to transition out of working for him to doing some work on my own. So I had a little consulting business, and he made some referrals for me. And then he also, at that time, he referred me to a fellow named Stu Spencer, who had run campaigns for Ronald Reagan and ran his gubernatorial campaigns in 66 and 70. Now, Spencer was on the outs with Reagan at the time because he had run Ford's campaign against Reagan in 76. Nevertheless, Spencer was still wired into Republican politics and campaigns, and I met with him, and we struck up a relationship, and I actually did a little bit of work with Spencer. I think I helped him with a speech, and so I had a relationship with him. But Reagan's campaign got into trouble. His own presidential campaign got into trouble in late August of 1980. He wasn't doing so well. He was stumbling around, and in early September, this was during the convention, Republican convention, and right after Labor Day when he kicked off his campaign, and Nancy Reagan and the others felt that they didn't really have a professional operation running. And even though they were very upset with Spencer because of what he did with Ford in 76, they decided it was more valuable to have a professional in the campaign. So they called him back. And Spencer said, well, if you're going to have me back now, I get to decide how the campaign's going to be run, and it's going to be run from the airplane because it can't be run from the headquarters. And if that's going to happen, then I get to choose who runs policy. I get to pick the press secretary, and I get to pick the tour director. And the one last thing I get to choose is a speechwriter. And then next thing I knew, I was getting a phone call from Ed Meese at the behest of Spencer. And Meese said, can you pack your bags in 5 days and join us at LAX and start the tour? And I said, oh, okay. Well, I had not planned on having a speechwriting role. I thought I'd have more of a research role. But I was willing to take any job they offered because I didn't think I was going to get any role in the 80 presidential campaign. I had listened to Reagan's convention speech while I was working in my garage. So I didn't think that I'd have any role in the campaign. And the next thing I knew, I was on what we called Leadership 80, flying into South Dakota or Iowa. I can't recall where our first flight went into. And it took me about a week and a half to start learning how to work with Reagan. And by, I'd say, the second week, early October, I sort of got the gist of how to work with him, and he got a little more familiar with me. And then we went into Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and a place, there's a mall there called the Oxford Mall. And somewhere out of my head, I came up with this line that we used at the Oxford Mall, and it was, ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? And we used that line in one of Reagan's speeches. And we massaged that line in the next few days, and then it turned into, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So that's how that was the birthplace. The Oxford Mall in Langhorne, Pennsylvania was the birthplace of what turned out to be one of those famous political lines in American political lore.
Oh, that's that is an absolutely fascinating story. And you
Well,
know,
that's
you
in
talk
the
in the
book.
book about, yes, and you talk a lot in the book about the relationship between Reagan and between Nixon. And I think you referenced that in Nixon's spare time, he would like to talk to you about the campaign and what Reagan's doing right and what he's doing wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, it seemed like Nixon was a political junkie trying to help Ronald Reagan.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because it was so, in those days in San Clemente, it was so fascinating, Mark. I mean, those early chapters in the book, because I spent dozens or hundreds of hours sitting there with Nixon, and he would observe Reagan in the '76 campaign with Ford, looking at how he campaigned against Ford and assessing whether he was doing the right thing or the wrong thing, how he was communicating, determining the effectiveness of his speeches, the effectiveness of Reagan's strategy, and telling me how Reagan, in his speech, what made Reagan's speeches so effective, and then pointing out Reagan's flaws, not because he was necessarily being negative about Reagan, but I called the way I looked at Nixon was that Reagan viewed himself as like a coach, that he was looking at Reagan in the way a coach viewed as an athlete. He saw in Reagan so many qualities that of a candidate that had such abilities that if Nixon could only take his Nixon skills and of strategy and shape and put them into and use them with Reagan's innate communications abilities, that he could turn Reagan into a real star. So a lot of times we'd sit there in frustration where Nixon would look at Reagan and worry about Reagan not using his skills to the best of his abilities. So those conversations, that's one of the reasons that I think the book is so interesting, is that never before has anyone written about how Nixon viewed Reagan in 1976 and 77 and 78 and 79 in terms of his run up to the '80 campaign, and what made Reagan such a great candidate, or what flaws he had which would deter him from being a great candidate. And when I joined Reagan, I adapted all of the things that Nixon told me in those early days, and transferred them into the skills that I was able to give to Reagan when I campaigned with him.
Wow, that is a fascinating look into both Nixon and in Reagan. Listen, Ken, we're going to take our final break here, 90-second break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the interaction that he had with President Reagan and some of the great storylines that are in the book. Folks, we'll be back in 90 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is General Mike Flynn, and I'm inviting you to join me on September 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern. That's September 4th, 4 p.m. Eastern. Mark that on your calendars. We'll be live on Patriot TV. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking only to our Patriot TV defenders for an exclusive discussion, a Q&A, if you will. Your presence is crucial as we dive into the matters that shape our great nation. And again, this is only for the Patriot TV. So if you go to patriot.tv, you can register today. There's a banner at the top of the website. You can sign up for September 4th, 4 p.m. Eastern. Together, let's stand strong for America's future. God bless you and God bless America.
Access to these events will be members only. So go to patriot.tv, click on Become a Member. It's fast and easy. Become a member today. Just go to patriot.tv, click on Become a Member, join today.
Attention business owners, are you ready to advertise to millions of loyal patriots ready to buy your products or services? Here's your golden opportunity to advertise with Mark Schaftlein. When you advertise on Election Edge, you've aligned your company with a trusted voice and connected with an audience that shares your values. Mark hosts the exciting new live show that delves into every facet of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, offering insightful analysis, expert interviews, and up-to-the-minute coverage of the key events and developments throughout the election season. When you advertise on Election Edge, you're aligning your brand with integrity, loyalty, and a dedication to truth. Mark's audience is passionate, conservative, and committed to the values your business stands for. When given the choice, Mark's followers will buy your product or service over other woke companies. Don't miss this opportunity to elevate your brand with the power of Patriot TV. Reach out to us today at advertise@patriot.tv.
And we're back with Ken. Ken, let me ask you this. You know, Ronald Reagan was a man who believed in tax cuts, limited government, and as one of the stories that you talk about in the book, someone who did not like debt at all. Can you relate to our audience some of the Reagan stories, you know, related to his economic ideas? He was a big believer in that, and some of the metaphors you used to describe how Reagan viewed the national debt at the time.
That's one of the great stories in the book. And in 1981, if you can believe it, the national debt today is what? It's about $35 trillion. We're approaching $35 trillion. Well, the national debt in 1981 was not yet $1 trillion. It was, I think, $989 billion. This was in February of 1981. And President Reagan was due to give a speech to a joint session of Congress on his economic recovery plan, where he was going to introduce his tax cuts and cutting the budget. And he was outraged. He was just outraged. He's been outraged all through his career about the national debt and the piling on to future generations. And he was just outraged at the notion that pretty soon that the national debt was going to hit $1 trillion. And he thought that the best way to make a point was not just say, well, the national debt's $1 trillion and that's very, very bad. That the best way to do that was to give an illustration. So I sent that speech up to him, my draft up to Camp David for this speech in February of 1981 about the economic recovery plan. And he had plenty of time to work on it. So he did a lot of editing and rewriting, and it came back in his handwriting. And my assistant, Nancy Roberts, retyped it. And so he called me when he got back. He called me from the Oval Office, and he said, Ken, he said, I hope you were able to read my writing. And I said, no problem, Mr. President. We have it all retyped for you to take another look at. We just have one problem here. You have this sentence in here about the national debt describing the national debt approaching $1 trillion, that it's so bad that if you stack $1,000 bills on top of one another, that it would reach up to the sky about 81 miles to reach $1 trillion. And I said, where did you get that? If you don't mind my asking, where did you get that number? And he paused for a minute, and he didn't like to be questioned very often, but I had to ask him, and he says, well, I did it by long division. So, okay. Well, I wasn't about to further question how he arrived at the long division, but in any event, when you have a president making any comment or statement that goes into the public record, it goes on for history, and you have to verify it. So I had to have my staff verify it and determine when you stack $1,000 bills on top of one another, how high it goes up to the sky to reach $1 trillion. And I didn't know at first how to do this, but I figured there's always some nerd in the federal government that you can find to get an answer to a question. Well, over at the Bureau of Engraving and Mint, we did find someone, and the answer came back, but they said we need to know first whether you want the answer in bound $1,000 bills or loosely stacked. So the president was off by a few miles. It was 63 miles if they were bound together, and 67 miles if they were stacked loosely. So I thought that was quite a story.
That is an amazing. I mean, he wasn't that far off when you think
No,
about it.
and I could just picture him doing long division, dividing it.
I'm trying to envision it right now. I'm just thinking the Gipper doing that. Ken, you had some other fascinating things in that book, and I want to relate it a little bit. Take a minute or two to talk about this, and then I want to get your opinion on the current state of political affairs in this country. But you had a fascinating take on the fact that, unlike some of the current politicians that just live off a teleprompter, Nixon and Reagan did not have a fondness for the teleprompter. I mean, sure, you said they would use it on State of the Union speeches, but neither one of them were big fans of the teleprompter, were they?
Nixon never used teleprompters when he campaigned at all. We gave him fact sheets and suggested remarks. He would take those and read those and then make notes, and then he would come up, study those, and then when he was campaigning, like if he was campaigning for a congressional candidate, or if he was going to a commemoration ceremony or something like that, he would just speak extemporaneously. He didn't use notes at all. He would just speak extemporaneously. And then with Reagan, he didn't use teleprompters. He would speak from half sheets. Just he would cut a 8.5 by 10 typewritten paper in half, and then speak off those half sheets. Look down on it, but he rarely looked down. And I'll tell your viewers to go back and look at his inaugural address. His inaugural address he gave off those half sheets. He did not speak from a teleprompter on his inaugural address, which is really very, very interesting. So when you look at I call the politicians today who use teleprompters, I call it the tyranny of the teleprompter. They're so glued to it that they're very ineffective as communicators. And I think that was, if you don't mind, that was a terrible flaw for President Biden, that he was stuck with the teleprompter, and he's passed it along to his successor.
Yeah, I concur with it. It's not one of my favorite tools either. Ken, what is you've got a lot of memories. I mean, my goodness, you're like a living history book. You've been involved in 9 campaigns. Share with our viewers some of the more fascinating moments with Reagan. Do you have a favorite moment with either Reagan or Nixon that you care to share with our audience?
Oh, with Nixon, I think it was when he went to the Oxford Union, and after this was in 1978, after we finished the book, and by that time, it was I believe in November, and the staff had all left by then, and I was the last one remaining, and he asked me to accompany him. He had been invited to do an interview in France, and then invited to the Oxford Union to give a talk. And he gave, that's when he spoke extemporaneously to the Oxford, a very famous speech. It's available on YouTube or the Nixon Foundation site. Very famous talk at the Oxford Union before the students. What was interesting was not only did he give that talk, but he did it with students in the room behind him were heckling him the entire time, and shouting and heckling and protesting. And he did it without notes or anything else, and did it without appearing to be phased at all. It was one of the most amazing experiences. And then after that, after that evening, I was able to dine with him, just the two of us, at the Claridge's Hotel, and it was just a wonderful experience. That was one of the great things. Reagan, I think there was a couple of them. One of them was on the eve of his inauguration, when I met with him, and he had just come from a prayer breakfast, and he was in bed having some tea and a toast before moving on to the next event, he was in recalling how moved he was by the event before, and he was just asking me if I had been to, and if I had been to the event the evening before, where the Mormon Tabernacle Choir performed, and he was just recounting all his feelings about what it was like prior to his inauguration, and he was so emotional, and it was just we were just the two of us in the privacy of a Blair House where he was staying, and I don't know how else to describe it. It was, you know, it was before he was president of the United States, and there he was so vulnerable. It was just sort of a magical moment for me. Just a farm kid from the Central Valley in California. Here I was by myself with the future president. I was glad to get out of the room because I was getting so emotional. I was interrupted finally by the Mrs. Reagan. I wanted out of there because I was afraid I was going to lose it.
Well, yeah, I want to share one memory. When President Reagan assumed the presidency, I will never forget the fact that those American hostages in Iran were being released when Ronald Reagan took the presidency.
Yeah.
Ken, I mean, what a fascinating look. What a great book, folks. Hey, we got about 2 minutes left, Ken. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask your opinion. What do you think about this current race, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris? You've been involved in 9 campaigns. How do you see the current tea leaves? You got about a minute and 30 seconds.
Well, right now I think she's on a sort of a sugar high. She's the shiny penny that came out of the Democratic convention, and everybody's seeing her as everything that Joe Biden wasn't. So it's very natural that she's everything that the sitting president was not. He was feeble and fumbling, and all of a sudden she's high energy and energetic, and she's even got a new bouffant hairdo. I've noticed. So she's everything that he wasn't. So that's going to wear off, and I do think the president needs to. President Trump needs to show a little more discipline and stay on message. I think he could take a leaf. I would hope he'd read my book about messaging and stay on message and focus on one message a day, limit it to that a couple of hundred words, a couple of minutes of messaging that, and make the media focus on one message and not give them the opportunity to meander along with them on things that don't count. So, but she'll wear thin after a while because she's not a very professional person to begin with. I call her basically a professional bureaucrat because that's all she's ever been.
Ken, we're out of time, David. I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to get this message to General Flynn to get it to President Trump to follow your book, because someone who's advised 9 campaigns and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, I can think of no better person to take some advice from. Sir, it's been an absolute honor having you on. And on behalf of everyone that makes Patriot TV what it is, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for appearing on our network today. Okay, folks, that's it for Election Edge today. We'll be back on Tuesday. We're going to have a special rerun of this interview on Monday. Have a great Labor Day weekend, and we will see you next week.